Okay. I think we're going. All right, this is our fifth year, the second half of the fifth year, and we're talking about astrological aspects. And we're doing that because in applied or practical astrology, the aspects are usually the most important part of astrology. And so we're looking at that so that we can be in touch with what's important. And we're currently studying aspect patterns. And right now we're looking at isolated aspect patterns. In case you didn't bring your sheets along, these are some sheets of the next 4 classes. We're going to work with case 1 tonight, and then case 2, and then case 3, and case 4, obviously. We're saying that isolated patterns represent isolated behavior. We are truly all one being, but it is possible for us to get so specialized in one area of consciousness that we partition it off from everything else. In which case, what happens is that one builds actually an entity in one's aura. And if it's serious enough, part of the personality just almost like a glacier calves off, and it's becomes something simple, something pure, something alone by itself. So in general, isolated patterns are not considered a favorable thing. Now we started by studying simple isolated patterns, and simple isolated patterns are when 3 or more planets form one aspect with none of the planets aspecting any other planet outside of that aspect. That's a simple. And then we looked at some examples, and we said that the best example of isolation in a character was Philip K. Dick, because he was almost fixated in the whole idea of identity, or what goes into identity. Now recently, we've been talking about compound aspect patterns. And in compound aspect patterns, 3 or more planets form 2 interlocking aspects without any of those planets in aspect to anything else. Because there are 2 different aspects, there is usually some kind of a tension. And the way it works is in each compound there has to be a benefic and there has to be a malefic aspect. So there is indeed a tension. And in that, one planet of the 3 or more has to be in both aspects. And that planet is considered a hinge planet because everything turns on it. There are other possibilities of 2 planets, 2 aspects within a single aspect, but we may get to that if we have time. Now you have the handouts. Everybody has one of them. That there are 4 cases, possible cases. And this evening and for the next 3 meetings, we're going to spend 1 meeting of examples of each of the cases. And in this time, we're looking at case number 1. Now, this is not an easy thing to do. I used 4-degree orbs in order to make sure that the aspects were obvious in their effect. And with the way the cosmos is set up, finding compound aspect patterns with 4-degree orbs is pretty tough. They don't happen very often. It's almost as if it's a mathematical thing. If you sit down with pencil and paper, or just start drawing positions of planets and have them move, you can see that isolated patterns are not favored by the way the planets move. And it's almost as if nature is saying it doesn't want that kind of isolation even in the macrocosmic sense of things. Now, when you do find, I spent hours and hours at this, and the problem is when you do find isolated aspect patterns, it often turns out that the people are not known people. They're unknown people. And you can't get very much from that. And even when it is somebody famous that you know well, it's not an easy go there either, because we don't have access to everything in people's lives. And so everything that we do tonight, it has to be sketchy, because basically my consciousness and everyone's consciousness is sketchy when it comes to this. All right. The first horoscope we're looking at, we're only going to look at 5 horoscopes, so it'll be probably a short class. I'm not certain of that, but probably, because there's some interesting people in it. This is the horoscope of Natalie Wood. Obviously, it is a case 1. It is a case 1 where we have the Sun is square the Moon, Mars is square the Moon, Pluto is square the Moon, and the Moon is sextile to Jupiter. Case 1 is what we are calling an external compound, meaning to say that the sextile is external to the square. If the sextile were here or here, then it would be an internal, but this is an external. And, oh, don't tell me, all right. The Moon, in this case, is the hinge planet. Now, this pattern involves 5 planets, which is not unusual. Very often, when we come to one of the last meetings in here, we're going to see some profound charts with all the planets in one aspect pattern. It becomes questionable when you have half the planets in one pattern. It becomes questionable whether it is something that's isolated or whether that is one behavior that has taken over the whole personality. So it's something, just to keep in mind. So we have Jupiter, Moon, Sun, Mars, and Pluto, and the Moon is the hinge planet. Now, strange as it may seem, this is a 5-planet. When you have compound patterns like that, 4-planet or 5-planet compounds are much more likely than 3-planet compounds. Because when you have so many in the pattern, then there aren't enough planets outside that can form an outside aspect, one of them, which would mean it was no longer an isolated pattern. So that's, there are surprising things when you look at the mathematics of it all. And this seems to indicate that specialization is more likely to be complex than singular, because if aspect patterns with more planets in are more likely than aspect patterns with less planets in, that indicates that there's going to be more complexity because you're putting together all of those planets in one aspect pattern. Okay, in this case, the Moon and Jupiter are almost an exact aspect. It's much stronger than any of the other aspects. But the problem is that there are so many of the others. And there is one very positive aspect struggling with, at the same time, in the same pattern, 3 very negative aspects. So it's a 3-to-1 ratio. Now, if we look at the intervals, if something is going around in the normal zodiacal direction, Jupiter is the lead planet. And the sextile gets actuated first. Then along, when something gets to the moon, then you come to the part of the pattern. If we're doing it by the interval rather than by the degree sequence, the sextile leads and the square follows. But when you do it by degree sequence, it's very different. The degree sequence is the sun. That if any of these planets is activated, the sun, because it's at the lowest degree, will be the first one to come in orb or to be activated, then Mars, then Pluto, then Jupiter, and finally the moon is at the end by degree sequence. And this makes the focus on the moon to be especially important because it's not only the hinge planet, it is the ultimate decider in terms of degree sequences. So that, all right. In this horoscope we have Libra rising, and Natalie Wood was clearly one of those very beautiful Libra rising people like Liz Taylor, but unfortunate for me, both Liz Taylor and Natalie Wood are dead, so I can't fall in love with them because I'm not into necrophilia. Venus rules the ascendant, and it's in Virgo, which is its fall. And that really describes her. Her beauty, she's very beautiful, but she's frail and she's vulnerable. You know, she has that always look like she could be harmed. And it's very, so we know we have an accurate horoscope here. In fact, the people who submitted the horoscope had good data behind it. So Venus is all about love, and being in her fall, it's likely to be unfulfilled love. And that's especially so with Venus in a mercurial sign. Venus in a mercurial sign is not always likely to have a rich love life. And on top of that, Venus is unaspected. It's out of the orb. The moon is coming toward a trine to it, but so this is somebody that is unlikely to feel really a good flow of love. Now, it isn't a matter that she's emotionally frigid, because this is a really emotional chart. Look at all those planets in Cancer, which are emotional. The moon is a double critical planet. Jupiter is in water sign, and in the moon is deposited by Venus, which is Venusian, is another emotional thing. So what we have here is someone whose life is basically an emotional life. Now, she's got a reasonable mind. She has Saturn is trine to Mercury, not a strong trine, but it isn't a horoscope of somebody stupid. And so she's got a good mental focus, but so much is focused in the emotions that this is a really emotional person. The emotions flow. She's not, she's not emotionally constipated. The sextile between Jupiter and the moon means that she has the Jupiter's in the 5th house, which is really great for expression. So it's, she's fluent. The moon is square to Mars, which is also emotional fluency. There's some restrictiveness that comes from moon square Pluto. So what this is all about is a struggle between love and marriage versus career. And it's a struggle between a woman in a man's world. Now, it's interesting the way this played out. The sextile shows that courtship always goes well for her. All of the most handsome people she had courtships with, like what's his name, and Shirley MacLaine's brother. Warren Beatty, and even Elvis dated her for a while. She had the poor taste to date Frank Sinatra, and of all people, she had a relationship with Raymond Burr, which I don't understand at all. Maybe it's because he was like a rock and she was that frail little thing. I don't know. She had a lot of courtships, but Saturn's in the 7th house. And even though well aspected, it makes it difficult for having a marriage. And there was always a struggle of holding the marriage together with her career. So this was never, ever resolved. She was married 3 times. The first was to Robert Wagner. And she liked eye candy, and she married a very handsome Hollywood producer and had a daughter by him. And that didn't last until she went back and she married Robert Wagner all over again. So it was, it's difficult. She was very feminine, but she had the clashes with the moon square Sun and the moon square Mars. Shows there are clashes with men. And her husbands were handsome, but they didn't necessarily appreciate her. Now she had a trapezoid. For some reason, I don't know if this is mathematically that should be the case or not, but I have found in these, looking at these isolated patterns, I keep running into a lot of trapezoids. On one hand, Mercury is square to Uranus, and Mercury is trine to Saturn. Neptune is trine to Uranus, and Uranus is square to Mercury. So you have a square, and you have a semi-sextile here, and a semi-sextile here, and that forms, this is one leg of the trapezoid, and this is the other leg of the trapezoid. Trapezoids usually turn out to be very positive things, but with the square being at the crown of the trapezoid, there's probably confrontational and not all real positive in that way. So the image that I get when I look at the whole chart is that this is someone who is emotionally generous, emotionally fluent, but she's always thrashing around. She's thrashing around to find in marriage what she finds in courtship, and the two are very different things. The people who have good courtships don't always make good marriage partners, or they don't always attract good marriage partner. And in her career, her career just didn't allow it. Since we're dealing with Natalie Wood, and it's still a hot item in the gossip sheets, she had the unusual circumstances around her death. She supposedly fell off a boat and drowned while her husband and, what was his name? He played the perennial bad guy. Christopher Welkin, I do have it in the notes. Were inside the boat. So an accidental death, possible. Mercury Uranus is likely to stumbling, and so it's believable that she had an accidental death. But a lot of psychologists like the psychology of rumor. Not that the rumor is factual, but things that are beneath the surface are often sensed by people, and then they come out in rumor and in gossip. And the gossip in Hollywood is that in that night that she died, that she walked into the room and found her husband, Robert Wagner, and Christopher Welkin engaged in homosexual activity. And there was a confrontation, and she sort of left in a kind of delirium, and that's when the accident happened. I don't know if there's really foul play that's suspected, and that's believable. With Uranus in Taurus, that's believable, but is it true? I don't know. How likely it is, I don't know. All right. I'm not that keen on doing a lot of astrology anymore, but I sure find it fascinating, the people that come up when you're trying to demonstrate something. Now, the next horoscope is an example of real isolation of character, real strong isolation of character. This is a case of case number 1, but it is with a C2. What we're looking at here is that, again, we have the moon as a hinge planet. We're looking at Mercury is conjoined to Venus, and they sextile the moon. So the moon is again the hinge planet, and the moon squares Uranus. And the way this worked out is fabulous. Now, I should mention right away from the get-go that there is an internal case. There's a case 2 in this, in that what's that? Oh. Neptune and I have musical accompaniment. Neptune and Pluto are sextile to Saturn, and Saturn at the same time are square to Saturn, and Saturn and Mars are sextile to each other. So in this horoscope, we have 2 isolated isolated compound patterns, and both of them involve 4 planets. So we had that, and the way this works out is just amazing. We have, all right, the moon is the hinge planet, and we have the Sun and Pluto and Neptune in a mercurial sign. We have Saturn in a mercurial sign, and we have an ascendant that is mercurial. So we have somebody here that was, tons of wit, tons of verbal ability. So this is so accurate, this chart. It's astounding. The strongest aspect in the bunch is the Mercury sextile to the moon, which means this is somebody that's really, these are the 2 fastest planets, and so this is somebody who's really super quick-witted, somebody that is mentally very fluent. And the Mercury deposits the moon on top of it, so the mind has a really strong influence in this. The lyricism, Venus conjoined Mercury, and puts together the love of Venus and the wit of Mercury in a Venusian sign. This indicates his ability to be very lyrical and very persuasive. The other part is the moon square Uranus, which is somebody who has no control over the emotions. It's like the emotions fly here and they fly there, and they're kind of wild. And it's the signature, one of the signatures in the male horoscope of homosexuality. He was openly homosexual. Despite this, he had a lasting and a good marriage. It was childless and it was sexless, but what it was when he was living in Paris, he met this woman who was about 6 or 8 years older than him, and she was wealthy. She had been associated, I think she had money on her own, and then she had been associated with a businessman who had treated her cruelly. And when she met, she could talk with Cole Porter, which is always desirable, especially a woman wants to have a man that she can talk to, not one of those, not one of those people like me. I can talk to the world, but not to my partner, not very much. And he, because he was connected with everyone, he was an ingress into society. So she was his confidant, and so they got along famously. Uranus is in the, what is this? The Uranus is in the second house, which shows not only emotional fluency, it showed that there was financial fluency. He had money from his success, and he spent it lavishly and spent her money as well. They had a party in which they invited for entertainment the entire ballet russe. And their parties, they had international celebrities, international musicians, and they were wild. They had a lot of cross-dressing, and there were all kinds of drugs and alcohol. And mind you, this is in the Roaring '20s, but this is not in the millennial time when drugs are available to anyone. And there was open sexuality of all kinds in the parties. But this is where the stress sets in. He made all of his money in all of his success. This was before there was anything like gay porn. He made all of his money using this sextile. He wrote love songs. And he wrote love songs for heterosexual people who loved them. But at the same time, he was homosexual, and it was all totally, out for him. And this caused him a lot of stress. And the stress resulted in stomach ulcers. This is, we can see that so far as we've looked at them, the sextile squares, at least the external ones, are not pleasant. Now, in this case, we have the internal, the case 2 sextile square. In this case, we have Neptune and Pluto and Saturn in a square. And there are not 4 more dark and heavy planets than Neptune, Pluto, and Saturn. So there's a sextile, he knew how to manipulate society from the sextile of Mars to Saturn, but this is still pretty heavy. Now, if this doesn't classically describe what is now called a bipolar personality, nothing does. And they're so deeply partitioned that the one isolated pattern, you wouldn't even know it's the same person when he gets into the depressive pattern. You wouldn't even know it's the same person as the one that's in the manic pattern. He goes wild, On top of that, the manic side is enforced by Jupiter being square to the Sun, which is, just like his song, anything goes. And literally, his songs were autobiographical in that regard. All right. So this is a bipolar personality. He's never ever fulfilled. If he's got the feeling up, he'd be in a party mood. If he was depressed, he couldn't get out of it, and he would be sunk down. And there was relief through the sextiles, but it was not enough. Eventually, the depressive part won out, because when the Sun progressed to the degree of the Moon's nodes, and eventually to the square of Neptune and Saturn, when the Sun got over here and was square to them, what happened was he was horseback riding, and there was a tragic fall, and the horse rolled over his legs, and he was crippled for the rest of his life, and in extreme, extreme pain. And eventually, at least one of the legs was amputated, and I don't know if both of them were. But it's clear to see the effect of autonomy in the personality when you have two very different isolated patterns like that. So not, there are sextiles, but they weren't enough to integrate. Yes?
Earlier, or almost at the very beginning, you said Mercury.
Sextile the moon.
Yeah, but you used some other term also.
No?
Something like places that are deposits it.
Yes.
How does it deposit it? I mean, because
It's disposed by itself because it's in its rulership. It is deposited because Mercury rules the 10th house. So to be able to get at the moon, you have to go through Mercury. Mercury is the doorkeeper.
because it rules the house.
Yeah.
Not because Mercury happens to be in the sign of Taurus while it even
No.
it's in the
No,
house.
no.
Kevin Kline did a great movie.
Oh yeah, on here like it.
Of the lovely.
But most of the world did not know about his depression. Most of the world did not, and I think that's because Saturn. I was going to play Where the Boys Are, or I was going to play Who's Sorry Now. Yeah. No, she didn't sing. Oh yeah, but Cole Porter, but Connie Francis sang Where the Boys Are and Who's Sorry Now. She even called her autobiography, which is a decent autobiography. She even called it Who's Sorry Now. This is yeah. This is another manic depressive. In fact, it is a case that was diagnosed as manic progressive, manic depressive. This is the very famous pop singer. I think everybody of our generation should know it. And this is a case 1, only it is a C1. In that the square, if you're going around the horoscope, the square comes first, square of Neptune to the Sun, and then that's followed by the sextile to Mars. In fact, the square between the Neptune and the Sun is stronger than the sextile of the Sun to Mars. The Sun is obviously a very huge planet in this. It's the hinge planet, and it's conjoined to the ascendant. And so this is the first one. I tried to make all of the examples to be involving either sun or moon because they're the things that are most obvious over the long run in all horoscopes. And this is a case where self-consciousness, which is difficult for a person who has the sun in the 12th house, is crucial to the fulfillment of the pattern or the resolving of the pattern or something like that. Now this one is unusual. This has only 3 planets in the pattern: Neptune, Sun, and Mars. So that means there's plenty of room for things outside of the planet. And we have another trapezoid, and I don't know whether that's a mathematical likelihood or not. I'll have to sit down sometime and figure it out. We have Venus. Where is Venus here? Venus is trine the moon. And Venus is, and Saturn is, Mercury is trine to Uranus. Mercury is trine to, where's Uranus hiding down there? So we have 2 trines. All right, Mercury and Venus each form trines. But let's see what happens here. The Venus is quincunx to Uranus, and Mercury is. I gotta stick to my notes more here. I'm not seeing it all right off the bat. Oh, Mercury is square to the Moon. And so the Moon is trine to Venus and square to Mercury. And Venus is quincunx to Uranus, and that should be about all the ones that there are. So we have, and then outside of this, we have the Jupiter, we have a 30, 60, 90 triangle. Jupiter sextile to Saturn, and Jupiter opposite Pluto, and Pluto trying to Saturn. That's the 30, 60. We might take a special meeting just to talk about the 30, 60, 90 triangle because it turns out to be so very important. So all three of these patterns are complicated, and all three of them are not integrated with each other. Three distinct patterns. So this is somebody that has trying to put together three different things on their own, and then trying to put them all together in one horoscope. However, the patterns are not at all quite as divergent as the Cole Porter. Even though she was diagnosed as manic depressive, it isn't as lead pipe cinch and as strong as it was in Cole Porter. In some ways, the patterns reinforce each other, and it's often to her disfavor. Now, the sun is in the 12th house, and because it conjoins the ascendant, her true nature, or the solar nature, the self nature, is not really hidden. It is Jupiterian. She appears to be a cheery, positive person, and she was. And it's magnified because the sun is sextile to Mars, and that makes her really zesty and almost zealous-like in her character. A lot of enthusiasm there. It was enough to make her famous and rich, and she was willing to spend. Fame is usually indicated by the 10th house, and the 10th house is ruled by Venus, so she would be famous for her art or something of that nature. And Venus is trying to the moon, which shows a very good feminine nature, because otherwise the sun sextile Mars, she would appear boyish or tomboyish or something like that. A few years ago we studied the chart of Judy Canova, who had a similar pattern, but she didn't have the moon trine Venus, so she was all of her life a tomboy and made herself a character to be of that type. Now, it shows her to be not quite so brash. She's female, definitely female. A person willing to speak out, but definitely feminine. Now, Jupiter, Sagittarius, I should say, rules religion, and the Sun square Neptune shows that there's some kind of strange, not religious delirium, but something in that direction. And the Sun in its 12th house has a very hard time understanding itself in the first place. And when you add the Neptune to its self-understanding, it comes very, very hard. She's not messianic, but she doesn't understand herself, and I think the reason she doesn't understand herself is because I guess you would call it a result of star delusion. If you perform and a lot of people admire you and worship you, and the whole country is singing your songs, it directs things to you that you're not capable of truly living out. A lot of rock stars turn to drugs to keep themselves boosted up when they're not on stage, because they're treated like gods when they're on stage, and they draw all of that energy from the crowd, and then they come off stage and they're just ordinary people again, and they want to be in that same kind of state, so they start using drugs. She didn't take drugs, but she did have some problems with being so positive and not understanding herself, that it led to the manic depressive kind of thing. Now the Mercury is in the first house and is square to the moon in the third house. And this is foot and mouth disease usually. she blurts things out, and it shows communicational fluency. So she would state things that probably were not good under that, under the duress of the delusion from being a star. She took chances, and she took chances with her voice. She had a nasal drip problem, and she took surgery. And when she had the surgery, she lost her voice for 7 years. She was married, again, Mercury square to the moon. She was married, it's a lot of fluency, she was married 4 times, and none of the marriages worked out. She was always looking, the psychological claim about her is that she was always looking for her father. She came from, her name is not Frances, it's a really long Francione something or another Italian name. And she came from a New Jersey Italian family with a strong dominant father. And she kept looking for that in men, but she didn't get it. So, her horoscope is fascinating because the Neptune opposite Pluto is an aspect of prejudice. And Jupiter opposite Pluto is an aspect of prejudice. It's the strongest aspect of prejudice that you can usually get. But she wasn't prejudiced about gays, not at all, because gays were some of her biggest fans. And they have a festival in Florida to this day yet where all of the gays dress up as people from the movie Where the Boys Are, where she sang the lead song, and they have a contest. They have a contest which gay can look the most like Connie Francis in the movie. And she loved them, and they played. There was a mutual relationship. To her, the Jupiter sextile Saturn is a matter of fact. Between the first house and the third house, she looks at it all as a matter of fact. And I suspect that it was a racial prejudice. It was a racial prejudice that was based in fact. At one point in her life, she was raped at knife point by a black man who beat her. And her brother was murdered. And those are pretty strong facts. And for that reason, though it never came out publicly, that's probably the prejudice that she carries with her. From the few facts that I know of her life, I don't know what else it could be. But at any rate, she's still active. She sings in nightclubs, and she still has a big fan club. If anybody wants the charts, these are the charts. She still has a very big fan club. She's still well-to-do, even though she spent a lot of money in her marriages and other things, and she squandered a lot of it. She still does well financially. And all right, but the Saturn, Pluto, Neptune, even as Saturn, Pluto, Jupiter, even though there's some positivity in there with Jupiter, it's still enough so that it is dark and heavy. And she does have the depressive side that comes from that. All right. Now, this one is a fascinating chart. I don't know enough about the person, but it's a very interesting chart. Most of you probably never heard of Oswald Spengler. Most people in the United States have never heard of Oswald Spengler. Oswald Spengler is mostly known in German-speaking countries and in Europe. He is a self-proclaimed historian, exceedingly well-educated. He took degree after degree, and then he went to various universities in Europe to continue taking courses and educating himself. And he eventually ended up being something like he was a tutor, or he did, pickup work like that, and he spent all of his time writing his book. And his book was called The Decline of the West, which in some translation means the undoing of the West. And his life spans about the same period as that of Rudolf Steiner. And Rudolf Steiner frequently quotes Oswald Spengler because he was, in some of his predictions, he was amazingly accurate. But Steiner didn't go with him all the way, and you'll see why. So he was at his prime at the end of World War I. And he saw how Germany was put in the corner with its nose in its stuff in the Treaty of Versailles, and he saw that nothing was fair for Germany and that it wouldn't work. So there are two isolated patterns in this. Okay. First of all, we have the Uranus is square to Mercury and Sun. And Sun is sextile to Jupiter. So this is all pretty fluent, all positive planets. The square is in common signs, and Jupiter is in Aries, which is quite assertive. It doesn't interact with Mercury except by association. That's one pattern. The other one is Moon down here is sextile to Saturn. And Saturn is square to Mars. But Mars is sextile to Venus and Pluto. So this is one side of a trapezoid. This is another side of a trapezoid. This is another. And finally, there is a quincunx border trapezoid with Mars. Way, way complicated. This is not a simple personality. It's all entwined. It would take 2 or 3 talks to really go into it well. The isolated pattern is what we're looking at, but both patterns focus into the 7th house. In fact, almost every planet in the horoscope is in the West. And the 7th house in this case means culture or civilization. And his whole idea of his history is what goes into the making of a civilization. And how is that culturally affected? And that's where all of his life was spent. The 7th house can be fine arts, but it's certainly culture and civilization. If we look at that quadrant, it's the quadrant of culture. Now, to him, the whole idea is becoming and being. He loved Plato because Plato had a philosophy of becoming. He hated Aristotle because Aristotle had a philosophy of being. Aristotle would look at this chair and say, this chair is a thing, it is a being. And Plato would much more look abstractly at the becoming of the chair. So the whole philosophy that he had is that culture becomes. It grows and it grows, and when it becomes a civilization, it becomes a being. And once you have a civilization, the civilization must go into decadence. He's talking about a turning point. Now, the turning point in this isolated sextile square that we're looking at happens to be in the 7th house, and it happens to be when culture is at its highest. So you can see that it's almost, you can almost take as a thesis that somebody's intellectual development is very likely to be autobiographical to what their character is. So his answer to all of this is found more in the other pattern, especially the Pluto-Venus part, which is the Pluto-Venus part is opposite the ascendant. And he was for strong relationships. He thought, not regressively, but he thought that the only salvation for the Western world, which included Europe and the United States, was to have strong relationships, preferably blood relationships. See, he was a big person on sanguinity. Mars and Venus together rule the iron and copper. That is the relationship between the two of them is necessary for a healthy blood. For example, people who have Venus screwed up are those people that, what do they call them, that have the vampire's disease? Porphyria people don't have Mars problems, they have Venus problems. So he believed in the strong relationship of National Socialism, as was trendy between the two wars. But he was not a Nazi. The Nazis loved him for his National Socialism, but they would not support him, and his books were eventually banished by the Nazis because he did not support racial superiority. He believed that blood bonds were helpful for holding people together, but that you could not base a whole philosophy on blood. So he believed in the relationship, but not necessarily believed in the how would you call it, the genetic superiority or something like that. He was mystically inclined. He has the Uranus trine Neptune, but he was not a practicing mystic. Nonetheless, many of his predictions were accurate. And it's interesting, there's all kinds of contradictions. He has the Uranus square Mercury and a Mercury and a Moon square, but a Sun square Uranus make for a lot of off the hip opinions. So he was very optimistic, even though he looked at history and saw all of these civilizations go into decadence once they became civilizations and didn't continue to become. He was optimistic that the West could be saved. But in his opinions, he believed that optimism was a sign of weakness. He saw it as a sign of cowardice. I think he's talking about Pollyanna kind of optimism or something like that. He was not a futurist, even though he in effect was a futurist. He didn't believe in futurism with all of that Uranus. And on top of all of that, the same thing happens with regard to Uranian things. He was not in favor of science or technology in such a way that he didn't believe that there's going to be a new drug that's going to save us from the new diseases that are now antibiotic resistant. He didn't believe that there was a new technology that was going to keep us from this or that. So he didn't believe in technology. He even believed that technology would be used against Western society, as in things like 9/11 and terrorists using phones to trigger off bombs for the becoming of their primitive religions. You see what I'm saying? His predictions are quite remarkable, and his attitude about technology, I think, is a healthy, not to be anti-technology, but to believe that technology is going to solve what people alone themselves can solve in themselves is wrong, is a good way of looking at things, even though his predictions were wrong.
What about the Uranus makes him feel this way about technology? What is his position?
Sun is squared to it. It's at cross purposes with technology. Yeah, he just that's not. And the funny thing of it is that all of his opinions, though some of his predictions were great, all of his opinions about it as a lasting philosophy were wrong. Because the future does not depend on blood relationships, and it does not depend on genetic manipulation or things like that. The future is, the only salvation for the future is altruism, but he was not an altruist. So it's an interesting personality, the twists and turns. And we have one more horoscope to look at, which is a real juice.
Steiner fell out with him because of the science thing.
I don't know what whether Steiner ever fell out with him or whether Steiner ever fully embraced him. He talks about many very good insights that he had, and that's the big thing, that he had great insights, but his overall philosophy didn't make it, and some of his opinions. So, like, his intuitive insights were quite good, but he confused intuitions with personal beliefs. All right, I said it was a juicy one. What? Yeah. Dr. Death. That's what he's famous for. Saturn is in the 10th house, and he's famous for his, where is it here? The Saturn is quincunx to Pluto. What are we looking at here? That's Saturn. All right, Saturn has this quincunx with Pluto, and he's just plain Saturnian is what he's famous for. Now, this is another case 1C2. What we have here is we have the Uranus conjoined Mars sextile the Sun. And the Sun is square to the Moon. And so it's 4 planets that you can count on for sure. The way it works, it's the C2 variety, because the sextile comes first, and then the Sun is the hinge planet, and the square, it ends up with the Moon. It's fascinating. I don't know how to say. There are all sorts of turnarounds in here. The issue is euthanasia, and I feel it fair to state that my views on the matter are rather strong, and they may color my interpretation. I believe the right to choose euthanasia is an individual choice. But the choice must be educated, because euthanasia is ultimately a suicide. And you have to know what, it's either a suicide or a murder. And you have to know what the effects of suicide or this type of murder are. And most people do not know that. And they do not know that some of the physical pain even lingers for 3 days after the death. And they don't realize that there is another kind of pain with the archetype spinning and no body there to absorb that pain and by living it out. So there is pain, and all of the arguments are very materialistic, and they're all of this plane in favor of euthanasia. I'm definitely for as a matter of personal choice, my personal choice is no euthanasia, no matter how intense the pain is. A lot of people don't realize purposeful living. And a lot of people don't realize that pain is a very important part of experience. And we're here for experience. I believe that letting pains sink in is an extremely important experience, one that causes more growth probably than all the pleasure that we've ever taken. So that's my view on it. I realize that when I state something like this, that view is likely to be tried. And I might very much have extreme pain in store for me in the future. But I haven't changed my view on it, and I don't think pain will cause it to change either. If we look at interval timing versus the degree sequence, we have an unusual relationship to Mars, to the pattern. If we take interval timing, things begin with Uranus-Mars, and then they progress to the Sun, and then from when the Sun is activated, it progresses through the square into to the Moon. So so Mars or Uranus are the first activators. The Sun is the crux planet. And during that whole sextile period and the basic character, the Sun, Mars, Uranus is very much likely to be impulsive. Then, so at the Sun crux period, at that turning point, the person is likely to want to continue to be impulsive. When the Moon is activated, then come doubts. And there are self-doubts and there are hesitancy. This is not a chart that in this pattern has a lot of blockages. It's just that there are doubts. It's not one of those like depressive charts with all those doubts to it. If we look at the degree sequence, the degree sequence is just the opposite. In the degree sequence, the lowest degree is degree of the Moon, 2. The next lowest is Sun, and the highest degree in the degree sequence is Mars, which means to say that in one way Mars is at the beginning of things, and in one way Mars is at the end of things. And there's a paradox here depending on what you're looking at. So if you try to apply this using fast transit or something like that, where you're using an interval timing, you have to look for opposite results than what you get if you're working with progressions or something like that, where you use degree sequences. You'll get different results or different accentuations. With the degree sequence, the diffidence begins first, and the self-analysis or the self-consciousness or self-focus is followed, and from that comes the impulsive activity. Now, there's a double sextile of, let's look at them here, Jupiter, oh, what is this here? Oh, I'm out of battery, I guess. All right. Jupiter sextiles Mercury. Mercury sextiles Neptune. Mercury comes close to sextiling the Moon, but the Moon is pulling away from that, so we still have our pattern. So we have a double sextile trine. So this is somebody that has a pretty good mind, and somebody who has an optimistic mind. He even looks at death, he calls it the good death. And there's even some intuition in this with the Mercury sextile Neptune. So, he's not stupid. The Sun square Moon is in mercurial signs, so there's mentalism there also. There's not a lot of tender, loving qualities. But, you know, there's a lot of mental qualities there. Now, with the sun in the fourth house, he's subjective, and he's uncertain. And he's uncertain about society because of the squares in the seventh house. And it's not clear to him in his subjectivity and his inconstancy with the sun in Gemini. It's not clear that the impulsiveness in him, whether it's due to intuition or whether it is due to desire. It is probably due to both. So his actions, when he takes actions, they're quick and they're expedient, but they are also shallow. There are not many deep planets in this chart. Only one fixed planet, and that's Venus, and we'll get a little bit to that later. So most things are common sign. Oh, there's Neptune is fixed also. Most of the planets are common cardinal, and so he does things quickly. But because things that are done quickly are not often deep, so they're shallow. Euthanasia is shallow. It's based completely on the material world. When the body dies, it's all over. And, you know, the world thinks that diseases happen and not that diseases are a matter of consequence. I had a doctor scream at me when I talked about a destiny etiology of cancer that I had. He couldn't believe that at all. He thought that resulted in guilt, that to think that you get a disease because you deserve it, he thought that was guilt-inducing. So that's the way the world sees things. It's pretty shallow the way it sees things. Now, we know, we can test, and we can see that when the person dies, that pain ceases. It's not completely true. There's enough bona fide seers around to talk about what happens after death and that have communicated with people that are dead. And there are enough around that have had the experience of the near-death experience where they could feel pain even while outside of their body. So it's shallow. We're dealing, this is sort of a wild, shallow, sanguine man in every sense of the word sanguine. Sanguine means bloody. He was so bloody that he took up painting as a hobby, and he painted gruesome scenes. And to make his paintings more vivid, he used his own blood as paint. He had all kinds of strange things. He painted death scenes. In fact, he had a thing when he would watch when people were dying, and he would put a video camera on them, and he would watch how the eye would change in a person as a person was dying. It's not really bad, but you know, he was fascinated with it. He thought they should even have special devices that when people were dying, wounded people, they should pump the blood from people who were dying into wounded people. a direct transfusion. And he didn't believe in capital punishment the way capital punishment is done. He said you should do capital punishment in such a way that you can harvest the organs out of the, none of this electric chair business where everything gets toasted. So in short, he believed in good death. Now, the way the sun works out in this, in the hinge of this all, is really, really interesting. He performed, or he helped administer, would be his use of it, a lot of what he would call euthanasia, but what I would call suicides. He set up these machines, or he set up devices where the person with the last little bit of energy that they had could trigger the machine and kill themselves. And he was indicted for murder something like 7 or 8 times, and he was acquitted every time because he never did it. But he kept getting more and more bold, and eventually he pushed the plunger himself. And he did it on videotape. And eventually he was sentenced for second-degree murder. And he had a 15-year sentence, but he let him out after 7 years. But no, let him out 8 years. He got out after, and he was a broken man at that point. And then he died. And when he died through the kidneys. The Venus rules the kidneys and rules the death, and it's square to Neptune. So some kind of, the kidneys broke down. There was probably some kind of renal poisoning. And that's all I've got. It's fascinating to see this thing, like when you get these combination patterns like this, a person goes over the same thing again and again and again, whether it's Oswald Spengler in history looking at the what's happening in the same way and interpreting it the same way, and in this whole business of fighting society and fighting the law in order to produce death and becoming stronger and bolder all the time in doing it. The patterns, it's amazing the way it comes out. Cole Porter, probably the best example we had all night. That's it.
Various forms of euthanasia happen on a daily basis, like at UW, if in the ICU, if somebody has cancer and they're respiratory, intubated on a ventilator, and the family decides to stop the ventilator, they will do a protocol to actually kill the person. I mean, it really is.
No kidding.
Killing the person. It happened with my mother. I didn't realize exactly what was,
What?
get more and more.
Well, turning the machine off is not it's more than turning the.
But then they give more and more opiates until they cause respiratory.
Oh.
They call it a protocol, or they actually.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's hastening. Maybe this person would die in the next few days, but they are actually killing people.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure,
Yeah. Yeah. You can be so absorbed with material facts that you don't see spiritual values. You don't see things like that are important.
And the nurses do it cheerfully. It's like,
Yes, we're taking the suffering away from this person. And what a way to go.
Out of pain. I mean,
Yeah.
I wasn't in pain.
Yeah, what a way. You're going out as high as you can go. Yeah. Well, I don't want to.
Anything written up about? She did not. She did.
Yeah.
I mean, they said, do you want to stop the ventilator? Yes. But then they were doing this protocol so that she wouldn't feel any pain. But there clearly wasn't any pain, but they were,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, I don't want to down them though, because I don't want to be a strong negative force. You know what I mean? It's a good thing to make the public aware of what's going on, and it's a good thing to talk about the injustice of it and the incorrectness of it. But I question people that get into causes and fight in such a way that they counter their own good, which is what happened here. Okay. Turn the heat back on before it gets too cold.